Good morning, ladies. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so hopefully you did the homework that was assigned. We were supposed to be doing week 5, overcoming the fear of joy, last week. And what we'll be discussing today is how the fear of joy from our past impacts our relationships with ourselves, with others, with God, and even our relationship with success, how we treat success. So I will be discussing how our fear of joy impacts our relationships with ourselves and others, and then Bethany will take it away and talk about how it impacts relationship with success. All right, so if you're following along in your book, we're on page 67. How dysfunctional families foster the fear of joy. As I go through this list, what I would like for each of you to do is just put a little asterisk or a dot next to all of these signs. Maybe you can relate to some of these, okay? So they are absolutely unpredictable. They are absolutely unpredictable. So when you were growing up in the chaos and the dysfunction of your household, you never knew what was going to be thrown your way. And so what happens is maybe as a child, you were hopeful that things were actually going to get better. And so you waited some time, there's no chaos, there's no dysfunction, maybe things are turning around, maybe dad has stopped with the alcoholic addiction or the gambling addiction, there's no more drama between mom and dad, maybe things are finally turning around. And just as you allow yourself to experience joy and let your guard down, what happens is, boom, another dysfunction, another event that takes place. And so what you learn as a child, the belief that you internalized is, I cannot let myself get too happy because just when I do, it will happen again. I'm sure a lot of you ladies can relate to that. The next thing is that they are not sure that the future will come to pass. So dysfunctional families, something that I have seen in my practice with adult children who come into my office, and they say that growing up as a child, they never planned for family vacations or college tuition. There just was no mental capacity to do so. They had to be focused on the present, but not necessarily in a good way. Their focus on the present was absolutely toxic. It was consumed with putting out the next fire, putting out the next event, such and such. So there was no capacity to think about the future. The next way that families foster the fear of joy is that they do a lot of waiting. Maybe as a child, you remember just waiting for things to get better, waiting for the success to come around, to be happy, or maybe this is a thought that you can relate to. I just can't wait until I grow up. Or I just can't wait until I graduate and get out of this house. Or I can't wait to get out and join the military and go far, far away. You do a lot of waiting to be happy than to actually be happy. Another way that dysfunctional families foster the fear of joy is that they produce people who think both well and poorly of themselves. Something that I see in my counseling office is that there are men, women, children who come from dysfunction. They have a difficult time with conflicting feelings of themselves. A few weeks ago, I provided a teaching on self-esteem and self-worth and the difference between those two. And if you can recall, self-esteem is what we get from the roles that we play, the value that we get from the roles that we play, whether you're mom, counselor, coach, teacher, all the roles that you play. And it's the worth that you get from those roles, whereas self-worth is derived from who you are. It's your intrinsic value. And what happens is when you grow up in dysfunction, you get those two confused. You may have high self-esteem, but very low self-worth, or vice versa. You may have very high self-worth. You believe that you're worthy. You have great capacity to see your intrinsic value, but not really have any belief in your capacity to do much of anything. Another way that dysfunctional families foster the fear of joy is by fostering a desire to prove self-worth through achievements. This is very, very, very common. If you grew up with maybe an alcoholic parent, maybe you believe, if I can just continue to achieve more, acquire more, I can cover up the sins of my father or the sins of my mom. The next point is that you are encouraged to wear masks. And so because of the dysfunction that maybe you grew up in your household, what happens is everyone knows that there's dysfunction. And mom and dad or a sibling may say, we know, but no one else can know. And so when you leave this house, you have to smile. And when you are asked, how are you doing? You have to fake the funk and say, I'm doing well. And I think about how often we actually do that on Sunday mornings as well. I mean, we may not be actually feeling well. We may actually be feeling really exhausted, and someone asks us, how are you feeling? And we say, blessed and highly favored. If we're being honest, where do we get that from? Those are questions that we need to begin to ask ourselves. The next way that dysfunctional families foster the fear of joy is by not esteeming heroes. The book provides an example that I'm sure many of you can relate to. It's the way that they do this is if you had a role model growing up, whether it was a teacher or a coach or a youth pastor or a youth leader, and you would come home and you would tell your mom about this role model that you would have, and it was almost as if it was taken like a threat to the way that they parented you. And maybe they would speak very ill about the person that you esteemed very highly and say, well, they're not that great because the things that I heard were that they're a single mom that's divorced with 5 kids, whatever the case may be. And so it's very, very evident that they may not esteem heroes. And the last point that I want to discuss is that they live on the emotions of one or more focal family members. This is very, very common. All too often what happens is there's 1 or 2 people, maybe mom, dad, mom, brother, who in a way, they are the emotional thermostat to the rest of the household. If they're not good, the whole family feels it. The whole family is not good either. And the reality is this is very, very dangerous because we all need boundaries. We all need boundaries. We all need to understand that just because mom is feeling a certain way, that doesn't mean that I need to pick up that emotional baggage. And so boundaries, let me define that for you. It's not on the slide, but just bear with me. It's emotional and physical barriers that define the amount and kind of contact allowable between members. Now, when you have clear and healthy boundaries, we can attain a sense of personal identity, yet allow sense of belongingness within the family system. There is a healthy balance between knowing who you are as an individual, but also knowing that you belong in this family. Now, when there's extremes of boundaries, that is what leads to dysfunction. So the first concept that I want to talk about is called disengagement, and I want you to picture in your mind a spectrum. On what side of the spectrum is disengagement? This is when we have very rigid boundaries. There's little commitment or closeness to the family. That's disengagement. On the other side of the spectrum, the book talked about it already if you did your homework, is enmeshment. It's diffused boundaries, very involved as one fosters dependency on parents or other members. So we'll be talking about the signs of both enmeshment and disengagement on the next slide. Signs of family enmeshment. This may be you as you review your past. I want you to put yourself in 5-year-old you shoes, 10-year-old you shoes, 15-year-old you shoes. Think about what was the experience in your life. What side of the spectrum were you on? In enmeshment, there is a lack of boundaries. There is a dynamic of over-involvement that makes family members feel close. As a matter of fact, trauma, chaos, and drama brings us closer. Individuality or a desire of independence is seen as a betrayal. If you approach your parents and ask for more boundaries, more safety, more security, you were shamed for doing so. Maybe if there was a lot of conflict between mom and dad and you went to mom and dad and say, hey, please, I know in the past you have come to me with your problems and concerns, but it's really impacting me. I no longer want to be dragged into this. Maybe your response was, how could you say that? How could you turn your back on this family after everything that we've done for you? And in enmeshment, there is a lack of privacy. This is very common if your parents or maybe someone else in your family felt entitled to your thoughts and your feelings and would frequently go into your room and open up a journal or diary that you would have hidden. So these are the signs of family enmeshment. On the other side of the spectrum is called disengagement. This is too rigid boundaries. Little to no involvement that makes family members feel distant and or cold. This is very common if you maybe would be waiting for your parents to come home after school and they would come home at 6, 7 o'clock. But you were not to bother mom and dad. You were to stay in your respective areas until they were ready to come and get you. Hyper-independence is expected in disengagement. So maybe you were the oldest of 3 kids and maybe your 6-year-old, 7-year-old self was expected to almost create meals for your siblings. You were expected to be hyper-independent at a very early age, regardless of what was developmentally appropriate. It may not be developmentally appropriate for a 6, 7-year-old to cook a 3-course meal. And then there was also too much privacy. You spent a lot of time in your room, maybe watching TV, playing video games. There was no connection, no warmth in the house. So think of this spectrum, on one side enmeshment, on the other side disengagement, and you may relate to one. You may say maybe there was periods of enmeshment and then there was periods of disengagement. We just bounced back and forth depending on what was going on. And this is also very common that I've seen in my practice with adult children of toxic family units. Now, the signs of both, the things that they have in common is when one member is emotionally reactive, all members become reactive. I'm sure that's something that if you have gone through past trauma, that is something that's you can relate to. A desire to fix or save family members, regardless of what side of the spectrum you are on, whether you feel like your past family unit was very disengaged. Maybe a thought that you had as you hid in your room was, if I can just stay out of the way, if I can just stay in my room, mom will feel better. I don't want to cause her more of a headache. Maybe if you were on the other side of the spectrum, enmeshed, you identified or developed a belief that says, if I can make dad happy, then everything will be okay. You took on his emotional baggage. And the last one is a belief that you're responsible for the emotional states of others. And so this slide is very important because as we are uncovering the layers of the onion and identifying, well, what was my family unit like? Were we very enmeshed, or were we very disengaged, or were we both? The past does impact the present and how we show up in our relationships. So we'll be discussing that in the next slide. We have three terms here that we are going to be discussing. I think that's mine. Oh, no, just kidding. Hyperindependence, codependence, and interdependence. Hyperindependence. If you grew up in a household that was very disengaged, very rigid boundaries, a lot of alone time, too much privacy, maybe over time you developed the belief, well, I just got to get things done on my own. And so you show up in a way in today's relationships very hyper-independent. Not to be confused with the term independent. It's a very good thing to be independent. But hyper-independence, what does that mean? It's when you choose to be independent of everyone, even though it may be negatively affecting you. So the first example that I can provide here is maybe the stay-at-home mom, first-time mom, who chooses to be hyper-independent and says, I don't need help, I've got this. I don't need my in-laws to come, I don't need my parents to come. And what happens over time is that maybe the way that it negatively impacts this first-time mom, stay-at-home mom, is that she grows very resentful of her partner for not helping. There's feelings of loneliness, burnout, fatigue. That hyperindependence is kicking in. According to counselor and author Dr. Frederick, hyperindependence shows up as a perspective of I versus we. We know that no man is an island. We all need each other. We were created to be in community with one another. And so hyperindependence is something that can be because of your past. The second term is codependence. Now, codependence, when we think about this term, people too often in my counseling office will say, well, isn't that the term that you use when it's an alcoholic married to a codependent? And I say, yes, but that's not always the case. Codependency is a tendency to do more than their share all of the time. A tendency to become hurt when people don't recognize their efforts, an unhealthy dependence on relationships. The codependent will do anything to hold on to a relationship to avoid the feeling of abandonment, an extreme need for approval and recognition. Now, if you come from a family unit that was very enmeshed, it's quite possible that you were conditioned to be this way. And maybe it's the big reason why you are constantly doing so much for your kids or doing so much for your husband. I mean, don't get me wrong, those are really good things. But if you're really, really genuine and true about it, it may be coming from avoiding the feeling of being abandoned. You don't want your husband to leave you, your kids to leave you. And there's an extreme need of approval and recognition. Now, what's the sweet spot? We want to be interdependent. This is the term that we'll be going over. It involves a balance of self and others within the relationship, recognizing that both individuals are working to be present and meet each other's physical and emotional needs in appropriate and meaningful ways. So those two parts need to be taking place. Number one, working to be present. I feel so often we're not really present. Our mind is stuck in the past, or it's stuck in the future about all the things that need to get done. And meeting each other's physical and emotional needs in an appropriate and meaningful ways. That can be very subjective, and it needs to be mutually agreed upon between both parties. So the interdependent spectrum, like I mentioned to you earlier, think of on one side of the spectrum, the enmeshed family unit. If you grew up in an enmeshed household, maybe you resonate with being a codependent. That's how you show up in your relationships today. And on the other side of the spectrum, if you grew up in a very disengaged household, Maybe the way that you show up in your relationships is that you are very hyper independent. Our past experiences are so important and they're so crucial because we develop beliefs about those experiences, of who we are, of how other people are. And as you can recall from a few weeks ago, we talked about beliefs being so powerful that they impact our thoughts, our feelings, and ultimately our behaviors. The sweet spot in the interdependent spectrum is a balance of the two, not being too hyper-independent, where you are negatively impacted and maybe growing resentful of the people around you, but also not so dependent on others that you just need their validation and affirmation. The sweet spot is right in the middle. So that is how our past impacts our relationships that we have with people today, and how so often the fear of joy can be consuming us based off of our past experiences and the relationships that we have. Now we'll be discussing how the past impacts our relationship with God and our beliefs about God. And if you're following along, we're on page 75 in our book. So on page 75, the author talks about how we have two concepts of God. We have the rational concept, that is our thoughts about God that we get from Scripture, what Scripture tells us God is. And then we have the emotional concept of God. And that's usually what we get from our parents. It's the programming that we get from our parents. I'm sure you all have heard here today, sometimes how we view our Heavenly Father is based off of how our earthly father and mother treated us. That is the emotional concept of God. And so if you grew up in a lot of dysfunction, you may be afraid of God based off of your experiences with your own caregivers. So it's very important that we examine, what type of relationship do I actually have with God? Who is he in relation to me? And as I go over these, I want you to maybe put a dot next to any of the ones that you relate to. So the first one is the Scrooge God. This is the God that has a bad attitude and doesn't delight in the things that you do or who you are. This is very common if you were maybe the lost child in your family. You were not delighted in by your parents. It was expected for you to stay in your room. Or maybe if you were the scapegoat of your family. The next one is the legal God, who is the God who ensures that you abide by all his laws and regulations. And this is very common if you were the chief enabler or the family hero. The next one is the gotcha God. The gotcha God is the one who follows you around and waits for you to mess up. He's just right around the corner, just waiting. This is very common if you were the scapegoat of the family. The next one is the sitting bull God. And I had to reread this section a few times because I wasn't really understanding it, but here you go. This is the summary of it. He is the God that's sitting in a yoga pose, all zen, waiting for your sacrifices and burnt offerings. If you were the mascot and the family hero, maybe you can relate to this. The only way that you acquired any type of attention or affirmation was when you told a joke or when you brought home your accolades. And so that was very appeasing to your earthly mother and father. And so what happens is you grow up and maybe you internalize that that is how God is with you as well. He's just waiting for your sacrifices and burnt offerings. The next one is the philosopher's God. The philosopher's God, he's very distant. He's working with the stars and the galaxies and the planets. He has no time to actually sit and be still with you. And this is very common if you were the lost child growing up. Mom and dad would come home from work exhausted. They didn't want to be bothered and play with you. Go to your room, honey, mommy is tired. And so maybe the belief that you internalize as a child is, well, mom and dad are always tired. Maybe that's how God is as well. The next one is the Pharaoh God. He's the God who cracks the whip, demanding more from us. Give me more, do more, sacrifice more. This is very common if you were the family hero or the scapegoat. Two very different roles, but the family hero was always doing more, and the scapegoat, even though they were not exceeding in all the things that they were supposed to be doing, maybe they were always instructed to do so by their parents. You need to stop acting up. You need to be doing more. You need to be studying more, paying attention more. So the belief that you internalize as a child is, man, my parents are always cracking the whip on me. They don't ever give me any grace. And maybe that's just who God is, the Pharaoh God. These views of God compel us to focus inward, depend on self rather than the God of the Bible, the God of love and compassion. And so now, as you reflected on how your relationships with others, with yourself, and with God impacts how you approach joy, I'm going to turn it over to Bethany, and she's going to talk about how it impacts our relationship with success.
So one of the most important things in this process is learning to change how we think of ourselves. I know it sounds like a very simple concept. However, it's not simple, because if you think about it in terms of, this is how I've been thinking about myself for 20, 30, 40 years, however old you are, and now you're trying to shift that way of thinking, it's going to take a lot of specific time and attention to really rewire how your brain thinks about things. So if you're thinking, I'm not good enough your entire life, then to suddenly just stop thinking that and to change it to a positive is going to be challenging and difficult, right? Especially if you have people in your life growing up also telling you you're not good enough. That makes it even more difficult. But one of the biggest components to cognitive behavioral therapy is focusing on changing those negative thoughts to positive thoughts. And one technique or one tool that a lot of cognitive behavioral therapists use, and if you've ever had CBT therapy, you may have seen this before. I use this a lot. It's called the thought record sheet. And it basically is what we're going to be doing, a shortened version today. But the thought record sheet, if you Google CBT thought record sheet, I probably should have printed some out for you guys, but it basically identifies the situation, your thought about the situation, your behaviors, your emotions or feelings, and then you come up with an alternative thought. So the idea behind this is that you're really looking at each of your thoughts and basically dissecting them to see how they are affecting you, how they're affecting how you feel, how they're affecting how you act. And then you focus on the alternative thought so that when you start to think that negative thought, it's just automatic in your mind, then your brain will start to think that alternative thought instead. And the more that you do that, the more your brain will automatically replace that negative thought with that alternative thought. Now, again, this is something that takes a lot of time. If you've had a dysfunctional family and had these negative thoughts for several years, it's going to take a while for your brain to be rewired in that way. But it is one of the important components of changing our thinking. And it's a tool that I found very effective for myself, my clients. And it really focuses on changing how you feel about certain events, how you feel about yourself. So, for example, if you have a friend that you think negatively about, if you already have a preconceived notion about them, this person does this, every time that they do something, whether it's big or little, that thought is going to come automatically back. So they could say hi the wrong way and you're, oh, there they are, they're doing that again. And you're already so negative towards that person that you automatically associate that negative thought with the person. So if you can work on changing that to a positive thought, then if they do something and say hi in the wrong tone, it won't upset you as much as it may have in the past. So the same goes for yourself. If you're constantly thinking negative things about yourself, if you mess up, which, let's face it, everyone will mess up, right? We're not perfect. Then when you mess up, then your thought is, well, here we go again. I knew I wasn't good enough. This is just another example. So we are automatically thinking these negative things about ourselves. And then when we do something, our brain is telling us, oh yeah, here you go again. So let's work through each of these positive affirmations on the screen. So the first one is, I don't deserve to succeed. So the alternative thought, and these are just some suggestions, you can come up with your own obviously, is I have as much right to succeed as anybody else. So this is where it's important to recognize your worth. You are not less than somebody because of your experiences. You are not less than a sibling, a parent, and you have every much as right to succeed as they do, regardless of your circumstances. So the second one would be, God does not want me to succeed, could be the negative thought. And you could change that to, God loves me and wants me to have a full life. The third negative thought could be, all successful people lie and cheat to get to the top. And so the alternative thought would be, many successful people get to the top by honestly applying talent and diligent work. So some of these are just things that you might think internally, and some are things that you may have been told. Sometimes I hear that a lot, that you can't get successful unless you lie and cheat, and that's not true. But if we're told something enough, then inevitably we're gonna start to believe it. The next one is, the good I deserve will never happen, so I might as well quit trying. So an example of an alternative thought is, the good things I desire can become realities if I don't give up. The next one is, I have to work harder than other people to get the same results. And an alternative thought could be, sometimes I may experience significant achievements with little effort as a result of experience, giftedness, and the grace of God. Oftentimes, I hear that from people, is that this person has it so easy and they never have to try to get to do anything. It just comes so naturally to them. And while that may be true, I guarantee there's some other area that doesn't come easy to them, and they probably just don't share that as much, right? Usually as individuals, we like to showcase our positives and the things that we're doing well. Like, you don't see on Facebook often that someone's kid is failing out of high school, right? You see when they won their state championship game. So whether or not you see that they work hard or you think that things come easy to them, there's always a different side to everything that we are seeing. We only get a glimpse of it. So another one would be, whatever I have accomplished has been fake because I was wearing a mask. And then the alternative thought could be, when I take off my mask, I will have more to offer because I will be more genuine. Cultivate an addiction to work that keeps me in a state of near exhaustion. And an alternative thought could be, I can take time off from work and be more effective than when I am exhausted. I think this is one that can be difficult for people, because I believe that sick days should also be allowed to be used as mental health days. Maybe someday that will be written into people's contracts, but sometimes you're just too exhausted mentally to go to work, and you have sick days for a reason. So you talk to your boss or try to find a way where you can use those to get some downtime, to get a day off. And it's okay, because we all get exhausted and we all need those breaks. Another negative thought could be, just give in to fear just before reaching a major goal. And then the alternative thought can be, I can walk through the fear I face near the accomplishment of a goal. I can risk evaluation after I have given my best. Another negative thought will be the future will never come. And a positive thought could be, I have a future and I can prepare for it. A few years ago, I was working with a teenage client. She must have been 13 or 14, and she said to me, I don't see myself beyond age 16. When I think about it, I just think of a black hole. I just can't see beyond that. And that was within our first few sessions. I ended up working with her for about 3 to 4 years, and maybe 5 years actually, because when she turned 18 and graduated high school, she looked at me and she said, I never thought that I would graduate high school. I never saw anything beyond 16 years old. And now I see myself in the future. Now I see I want to be an EMT. I want to do all these things. And when I first met her, I would try to talk to her about her future, and she said, Bethany, I don't see anything. I just see blackness. And changing the way she was thinking and really getting her to identify different things throughout her life, but to see that progress from a black hole and just black nothing to I can actually see myself succeeding. That's what changing the way that you're thinking, it can have such a huge impact. And then the last one we'll talk about is maintaining my commitment to stay on the edge of success without ever achieving it. And then the alternative thought is life can be exciting even when I do not live on the edge. So all of these, again, you can create your own positive affirmation or alternative thought for any of the negative thinking that you have. These are just some suggestions just to kind of get you started, because sometimes people are like, there is no positive to this. And my encouragement would be, I guarantee we can find a positive alternative thought. You just might have to dig a little deeper for some of them. And then the last thing we're going to talk about today before we break up into our small groups is the steps to moving beyond the fear of joy. And this was on page 81. So the first question you need to ask yourself when working on moving beyond the fear of joy is, on whom am I depending? So are you trying to only depend on yourself? Are you depending on God? Are you depending on other people? I think being here is a great start, because you're not just depending on yourself anymore. You're here sharing with other people and talking about how God has impacted your past and how he's here in your present and your future. So you guys are already on the step of you're not just depending on yourself. One of the reasons why I love doing counseling with Christians is because we can incorporate God in our faith. I've worked with so many clients who were atheist or not religious, Catholic, Muslim, different types of religions. And it was very challenging. And I still work with some through my private practice, but it can be very challenging and discouraging at times, because you can't bring in the aspect of God that we're able to bring in here and at the counseling center, because that is such a huge component to healing. Obviously there's more components to it, and I'm not saying, just pray and then everything will be okay, but prayer does help. Prayer is a great coping skill. And so sometimes it can be discouraging to work with clients who have no hope in God or no faith, because at some point they're only going to get a certain distance. They're not going to be able to fully move on and heal through their past if they don't have that hope of heaven and the hope of Jesus Christ. And so with this first question, on whom am I depending, I think this is great for us to talk about here and maybe in our small groups as well, because are you just depending on yourself to do this? Are you depending on God? And what does that look like for you? What does it look like to depend on God? Because it looks different for everyone. The next concept is clean out the closets of your past. So it is important that we focus on healing from the past, processing it, allowing ourselves to feel the emotions, and then moving through it. I know that's a lot of steps to get there, but a lot of times people will just say, well, it happened in the past, I don't need to think about it, and we're just gonna move on. But which for some people, that's okay. But some people I will ask, well, have you really processed it? Have you felt it? Or did you just compartmentalize and push it down and go on with your busy day and your busy life? And then when you think back to it, you think, oh, I haven't really felt those emotions of grief. I haven't felt those emotions of pain. I just pushed through them. And so this will look different for everyone. Some people may find it helpful to write a letter to people from their past who hurt them, a letter that they send or do not send, that they maybe burn after. And they just write what they would say to the person, knowing that this person will never see it, but it can be a very therapeutic way to express how you're feeling and process the emotion without actually having to talk to the person. Some people may need to confront the person. It just depends on the situation, and they may need that to move through the past and to work through that relationship, whether they have a relationship with that person now or not. They may need to do that. They may also need to set boundaries, like Tatiana was talking about, and maybe cut some people out of their life that are causing them to have triggers from the past that are unhealthy relationships. So each of these it's different for everyone, and I can't tell you what you need to do, obviously. If I could, then that would be way too easy, right? And so you'll each have to think through your own experience. Everyone here has a similar experience, but they're all different. And so you'll have to really look into your closet and think, what do I need to move on from this, and what do I need to process through this, and to feel these emotions and to move on from these emotions. And that's only something that you can really decide, but those are some suggestions of maybe ways that I've seen helpful for some people. And then the last one is, when you are frightened by joy, learn to live in the here and now. So in counseling, we call this grounding exercises. You guys remember we did a grounding exercise last week with Giselle, right? Yes, okay. And then we did one a couple weeks ago with me. So we're going to do another one today. I do not have as soothing of a voice as Giselle. She's a very soothing voice. But we're going to do a grounding exercise that really helps you be focused on the present. And now some of these grounding exercises that we're doing, you may think, this is crazy. I don't want to do this. This doesn't work for me. That's totally okay. All the coping skills and exercises we do, some may work for you, others may not, and that's fine. I just want to give you some tools so that when you are at home, that you have these tools that you can say, oh, you know what, that one was really helpful, or this one was really helpful, and kind of create your own toolbox of coping skills. So this is my favorite one. This one is called the 5 senses grounding technique. And so this one really focuses on bringing you to the present and focusing on the here and now. Like Tatiana was talking about, we're often so focused on the past or so focused on the future that we're not really in the present. I could be standing here and thinking of 1,000 things that I have to do later today, and I'm not really focused in the present, right? And that's just how we work as humans. We're just so focused on other things. Now, you cannot multitask. So people think that you can. You cannot multitask. Your brain physically cannot multitask. It can dual task, where you're thinking of other things and doing something else, but you're not really focused on one or the other. So your brain really is not set up to multitask. It really does not know how to multitask. We use that as, in my opinion, as a excuse to not fully be present, because you're like, oh, I'm multitasking, but you're not really focusing on one thing. You're focusing on a bunch of different things, which is an excuse to not really focus on the thing that you need to focus on. So these grounding techniques basically force you to focus on the present and your current surroundings. So with the 5 senses grounding technique, we're going to look at the 5 senses. So it's the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So we're going to start. You can keep your eyes open for the beginning, because the first one is the sense of sight. So you might need to look around. So with this one, I want you to start by taking a deep breath and then a slow release. And I want you to acknowledge 5 things around you that you can see. It can be a pen, the ceiling, the table that you're sitting at, but 5 things that you can see. Now acknowledge 4 things that you can touch. It could be your hair, your nails. Do you pick at your nails? Do you feel the nail polish on your nails? Maybe you can feel your chair, the ground at your feet. Now acknowledge 3 things that you can hear. Could be the breath of the person next to you, my voice, the sound of a chair moving, the air conditioning. Just 3 things that you can hear. Now acknowledge 2 things that you can smell. This could be the perfume of the person sitting next to you, maybe the soap on your hands from washing your hands earlier. Just 2 things that you can smell. And lastly, 1 thing that you can taste. This could be the coffee from this morning left on your tongue, that muffin you had on the way to group, the taste of your toothpaste. What is 1 thing that you can taste? Now take a deep breath in, slowly release. And this is the 5 senses grounding technique. So this is something that you can do pretty nonchalantly if you're having anxiety, if you're trying to just really focus on the present, trying to figure out what your emotions are. This is just a way to bring you back to current. It's really hard to focus on other things when you're focusing on, what am I tasting? Your mind is not thinking, oh, when I get home, I need to do this. It's focusing on, what am I tasting? What am I smelling? And so this is just an easy one that you can do. Like I said, pretty nonchalantly. No one really even has to be aware that you're doing it, but it really brings you back to the current.